And I started working on seahorses because I was interested in the evolution of sex differences. I'm now working on seahorses partly because they still fascinate me, and partly because they face real conservation challenges. These then are seahorses for sale in western wholesale district of Hong Kong. And I've worked on seahorses for about 16 years. But when I put all the seahorses that I've ever seen live into one pile, should I do that, they would not be as big as the volumes in these two bins. So this is a large number of seahorses indeed. And I hope to give you a story about how a carefully managed approach to seahorse conservation can indeed help us with global ocean conservation as well. And as a first introduction to this, let me tell you about a land-breaking, land-shaking even, event that we managed in 2002, when 167 nations voted for the first time ever to bring commercially important marine fish species under international regulation and international controls. More on that later. But it really shook up our capacity as a global community to ensure that marine fishes are treated with respect. And the species that were first brought under international global management were indeed seahorses. That has changed the landscape quite a lot, as I plan to tell you. In this talk, then, I'm going to start by introducing seahorse biology to you, tell you a little bit about the threats that seahorses face, and then tell you about some of the conservation responses which we believe can make a difference for these fishes, as for so many other organisms and systems in our oceans. So starting with the seahorses themselves, there are about 34 species, new ones keep being added and subtracted, found in most temperate and tropical oceans. And yes, you have them on this coast. They go from Nova Scotia down to about Uruguay. So pretty much from about 50 degrees north to 50 degrees south. This is one of the smallest species, the short-headed seahorse, or Hippocampus breviceps. And he's holding on to one of the largest species, the big-bellied or pot-bellied seahorse, Hippocampus abdominalis. Those are not, the abdominalis is about the biggest seahorse you find, but the smallest is about the size of your baby fingernail. Okay? That's an adult. The largest is about a foot. So you really have a wide range of species sizes, and I'd like you to hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to it. These animals are really quite sight faithful, and in many species, the animals may only move a couple of square meters throughout a reproductive season or even over a couple of years. So they really tend to stay in one spot, also important. They defend themselves largely by camouflage. So for those of you having trouble finding the seahorse here, the snout is here, the eye is there, and this is the animal with its tail down here. They can grow skin filaments to blend in with their backgrounds. They can change colors in order to match whatever substances are around them. And they can allow encrusting organisms to settle on them so they blend in perfectly. And I'm always struck by some seahorses I worked with in Australia. We'd marked out a grid on the ocean bottom, and we had used that fluorescent flagging tape that's used on survey crews, bright orange, fluorescent orange, in a very dark and gloomy environment. And some of the seahorses moved and sidled up to this orange tape and turned bright fluorescent orange, desperately proud of how camouflaged they now were in the ocean bottom. So they can get a bit wrong. For the most part, this camouflage serves adult seahorses quite well. You don't find much predation, but here's one example of pretty embarrassing predation on seahorses. So when seahorses are threatened, they hold on ever more tightly, which is all right if you're trying not to reveal your presence by a flicker of a fin, but not such a good idea when what you're holding on to is a sea urchin who's met another sea urchin, both of whom are hungry. So this is the snout of a seahorse, this is its eye, and its body is down here, and this seahorse is becoming a meal for two urchins. Not a very sensible animal. For the most part, however, they don't experience much predation as adults. All that aside, the truly interesting thing about seahorses is probably their reproductive cycles. So if we start here, this female and this male, short-headed seahorse, are dancing together as a couple. And in many species, the female comes in and finds the male every morning at dawn in a greeting ritual. She dances with the male by holding tails, and they will pirouette around the seagrass bed. They'll hold on to each other and promenade across the ocean bottom. And this persists every day of the male's pregnancy. The female just saying, I'm still here. The day that he gives birth, no rest for the weary, or the wicked perhaps, she arrives with a full load of eggs. They go into a courtship that can last 9 hours, which, if you're watching them, becomes a very serene form of marine meditation. And then they rise up through the water column. The female inserts her ovipositor into the male's brood pouch, deposits the eggs where they're fertilized. And you should take note of that, all you men in the audience, because the male seahorse can be absolutely certain he is the father of his children. The eggs are then embedded in the pouch tissue of the male, and they're provided with oxygen. They're provided with a placental fluid that nourishes the young, and they're protected in an environment that becomes more and more like salt water as the pregnancy progresses. Eventually, after something between about 10 days and 6 weeks, the male goes into labor. And these two are white seahorses from Sydney Harbour. And the male pumps and thrusts and folds and pushes in a jackknifing action in order to propel the young out in spurts. And sometimes he can take many, many hours, even days. Quite an exhausting business. The young are expelled from the pouch and are fully independent at birth. They're about half an inch, a third to a half an inch, and they go their own way. There's something between about 5 young in the smallest species and about, well, James, 1,572 young, but it can apparently sometimes get up to 2,000 young. The young of almost all species are crudely the same size, which is why they have relatively few in the small animals. So the young seahorse, by the time it emerges from the pouch, is first of all terribly cute, but secondly is a fully formed fish ready to swim and take charge of its own life, as it were. The problem with this particular life history is it makes them terribly vulnerable to overfishing. So where you have low population densities, it's quite easy to extirpate them or eliminate that particular population with incautious fishing. If you have low mobility and small home ranges, then clearly it might take a while for a depleted population to be renewed, at least by adults. If you usually have fairly low rates of natural adult deaths, then of course any fishing is a new pressure on the population. This is true of many species, not just seahorses. Where you have male pregnancy, then if you extract the adult, you're taking the young as well, unlike fishes that just spawn into the water column. Where you have faithfulness to one partner, then if you remove the female, the male takes a long time to remate, or vice versa. And their fidelity is such, as an aside, that we've had situations where a male has had a very damaged pouch, and the female has come in to greet him every day for several months, refusing other opportunities to mate. So committed was she to that partner. The small brood size, compared to most fishes, many of whom can release 200,000 or even 20 million eggs at a time, obviously means that your populations may take longer to recover from overfishing. Although we have to keep in mind that their young are born at a pretty mature, in a pretty mature way and may be able to survive better than the young of many other fishes. All in all, though, I think we can say that seahorses are not the best fish in the world for heavy fishing. So I was working on the evolution of sex differences in seahorses when I was always with the intent of eventually moving on to save the world. When I crossed a plaza in Berlin called Fürstendamm back in '91, and above it, scrolling on an electronic billboard, was a statement to the effect that the Philippines' most valuable fisheries export is seahorses. And that was, to use the literal translation, in order to help men with weak tails. So, of course, I got quite intrigued in the seahorses, not the weak tails particularly. And we decided to go off and try to have some attempt to understand the level of exploitation. There were no records, no way of assessing the trade, so we set off and actually visited fishing villages and communities and markets and universities and colleges and talked to ferryboat captains and talked to people driving tricycles and anybody we met that might tell us something about this trade. I have to say most government officials thought we were completely bonkers asking about these cute little fishes that couldn't possibly be important. But eventually we did track down a story about the trade in seahorses that has led to some pretty significant conservation action. We found that seahorses were used in 3 significant ways. They're used for ornamental display in public aquaria and also by hobbyists, of course, around the world. They're used for curiosities and souvenirs. And this yo-yo proudly declares that it includes a real seahorse. And the back of the yo-yo, it announces that this product was created by a company called Small Minds Press. It seems to work fairly well. The third use for seahorses is in traditional medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine, or I will call it TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, but many other forms of traditional medicine too. The Korean and Japanese derivatives, Ayurvedic medicine from the Indian subcontinent, folk medicine in the Philippines, and most prominently Jamu medicine in Indonesia. Now, I want to take this opportunity to be quite clear that in no respect do I wish to be dismissive of the use of these animals for traditional medicine. TCM is trusted by 1/4 of the world's population. Traditional medicine forms an important component of healthcare for 80% of the world's population. TCM has been codified for over 2,000 years, and the World Health Organization is completely comfortable with traditional medicine as a contributor to healthcare. So we're not talking about judgment on the forms of use. We're talking about an attempt to adjust the nature and volume of use to sustainable levels. Traditional medicine is the biggest consumer, but the other trades certainly play a role in causing conservation concern. These seahorses are usually, let me rephrase it. Many seahorses are caught directly by affluent aquarium fishers, for example, in North America or USA or in Australia, but primarily by subsistence fishers who have turned to seahorse fishing as more or less an occupation of last resort. When all else is depleted, you might consider seahorse fishing, but it's neither easy nor particularly lucrative at that stage. It's also, depending how you do it, potentially very dangerous. So these seahorse fishers are down at about 12 to 15 meters, I have to do my feet down, about 45 feet depth. They're connected to the surface by air hosing that you would use in an aquarium, clenched between their teeth. And the air hosing runs from a compressor at the surface, which is usually looked after by their 6 or 7-year-old child. When the compressor shuts off, they bounce to the surface to see what's gone wrong. They fix the compressor, and they bounce back down again, several times a night. And if any of you are divers, you'll know that this is not a sensible, clever thing to do. But I suppose if you're feeding your family, you do your best. They don't last long. Many of them get bends. They do catch many other things as well. Seahorses are part of the catch. Other fishers go down duck diving, using the light of a lantern over the water and plunging up and down all night long, getting whatever they can to feed the family and sell, with seahorses as one of the most important cash incomes in certain parts of the world. However, a rather large proportion of seahorses come from shrimp trawls. This is a shrimp trawl sorting going on in India, and it's pretty representative of shrimp trawls in that part of the world. Tropical shrimp trawling usually gets between 80 and 95% non-shrimp. This, I think, has to be a matter of great concern. First, for the loss of food security, because many of these products could have fed people. And secondly, for the loss of biodiversity, the conservation concern. In this picture, you can just see a seahorse tucked into some of the debris from the shrimp trawl. Each trawl may only bring up 1 or 2 seahorses, but the number of trawls is so huge that Vietnam now brings up about 5 million seahorses a year. In many parts of the world, such as the North Sea, trawls may cover the same ground 10 times in a year. The consequence is that we're mowing the bottom of the ocean and taking out everything in our path in a clear-cutting action. And referring to John's comment, the single best thing you can do for the oceans is refusing to eat trawls from shrimps from trawls, which is primarily imported shrimp, although there are issues with the Gulf of Mexico shrimping as well. So if you're at all considerate of the oceans, you basically will swear off imported shrimp. So when you put all this trade together, you get very large volumes. Something like 45 metric tons of dried seahorses come through just the major Asian trade centers for dried seahorses. To give you a sense of scale, this pile by my colleague Samuel is only 100 pounds of seahorses. So you can imagine just how big the global seahorse trade is. I should point out that the aquaria and the hobbyists also consume many seahorses, primarily hobbyists of course, and in many regions the primary pressure is that aquarium trade. So although proportionally it's much smaller, it certainly is responsible for also adjusting its consumption. Our work on the seahorse surveys was a bit imprecise to say the least. I mean, it's not terribly scientific in a formal sense of the word to go from fishing community to villager to fisher to trade manager and try to pull together statistics. We did our best to look at ways of cross-validation, but nonetheless, you're guessing to some extent. And we're always very honest about our guessing and are willing to adjust as we find out more. Thanks to our first trade surveys, we excited enough interest that we were able to convince some jurisdictions to start documenting the trade in a formal way. We had guessed that in Hong Kong, about 7 to 10 tons of dried seahorses were processed every year. So it was something of a relief, although not a nice one, to discover when we got the trade statistics started in 1998 that even the first rather sketchy reporting showed a trade of at least those 10 tons. And indeed, over the years, as traders have come on board with their documentation, we've now got a trade in the order of 27 tons of seahorses just through Hong Kong. And these trade statistics are helping give us confidence. These are almost entirely for traditional medicines. The trade in traditional medicines has expanded globally as populations are depleted and local sources are less available. And in 1993 to 1995, it was the gray countries that were trading seahorses according to our analyses. By 1998 to 2000, the countries in yellow had joined the trade. And you'll notice that the countries in yellow are primarily in Latin America and in Africa. Most of these are genuinely new trading countries and not just new surveys. So when you put all this together, you start to see a conservation concern. You have a global expansion in trade, catches are declining, even as fishing effort increases. The dry trade is increasing steadily. I'm not going into all the statistics. The live trade is more or less stable. Much more of the shrimp trawl bycatch was being retained or sold as demand outstrips supply. And under international assessments by the World Conservation Union, all species of seahorses were considered threatened, or we didn't know enough to even assess them. A further significant concern comes in the habitats, damage and destruction. These animals live in seagrasses, coral reefs, estuaries, and mangroves. These are the coastal habitats that are particularly significant for the world for coastal protection and for fisheries nurseries. They're also among the most threatened. And in this way, seahorses are great flagship animals. Seahorses can represent a lot of marine conservation concerns. They're highly charismatic. They're ecologically important, medicinally important, economically important, biologically interesting, culturally important. They are a global concern and are subject to pressures familiar with many other species: overexploitation, indiscriminate removal, and living in habitats of pretty great general concern. They also theoretically will benefit from a whole range of different conservation responses. Now, when we turn to attempts to conserve marine fish species, we tend generally to think of working with the marine fish. And that's really missing the point in most contexts. The marine fish are certainly at the center of our concern in many conservation dialogues or activities. But they are managed within a context of the needs of fishing communities, the fishers themselves. The fishers have families who are dependent on these resources. The families live in communities that are very fishing oriented. The communities are part of provinces that have legislation and economic pressures and priorities, and part of countries that have determined how they wish to address their resource management and their social development within a framework of a world that exerts an awful lot of pressures that gradually contract in on the fish in the middle of the story. And we must take into account the fact that the fish have no elbow room, but the fishers have no elbow room. The consumers are under pressures. It's a global dynamic that basically determines what will happen to the marine fish and how much wiggle room we have for conservation. We ignore this global dynamic at our peril. So, given that the fishers are closest to the fish in the center of our world here, our onion world, if you like, I started talking to fishers recently in a very focused way. I've been working with them for years to try to understand what we might do about reconciling fisheries with conservation. Project Seahorse works in many countries, Australia, Portugal, South Africa, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and so on. But our focused effort is in this island of Bohol in the central Philippines. Bohol is fringed by a double barrier reef, which extends about 100 miles. And there are very few double barrier reefs in the world. I think about 6 in the Indo-Pacific Ocean anyway. This is a special habitat, and it used to be one of the most important areas of the world, areas of the Philippines for fish production. However, indiscriminate fishing and overfishing and abusive coastal management has led to gross depletion of these resources, and fishing communities now struggle to feed their families and certainly don't have much to sell. So our team in the Philippines is entirely Filipino: biologists, development officers, educators, development specialists, social workers, and they've been catalyzing the creation of Kamada, which is now an alliance of 700 subsistence fishers. Most of them have very little formal education, but together they have found a voice that is proving remarkably strong for resource management. And I sat down with them to have a focused discussion on reconciling fisheries with conservation. I've translated from the Cebuano language, but the words, the ideas are entirely theirs. Not taking a small fish, setting up no-take zones, stopping unfortunate fishing methods, finding other ways to earn a living, making sure that the whole community is involved, sorting out governance issues, which is really important in every country, including our own, getting international engagement, and looking at human population size. I was particularly struck by the words of one fisher. He had briefly trained to become a priest and therefore had learned some English. And these are his exact words with no translation. When asked about how to reconcile fisheries with conservation, he said, "Amanda, conservation is personal discipline." And to be honest, I can't think of a better definition of conservation. It's about making choices that you know to be correct and disciplining yourself into following through. And that, from the mouth of a marginalized seahorse fisher, was pretty powerful. So when you take their ideas as sketched out here, they work beautifully in my onion world. We start with the fish, their ecosystem, the community and its extraction, society, governance, international support, and the global ultimate pressure of population size and consumption. So I'm just going to sketch out a few conservation responses to our problem of managing the extraction of seahorses in a sustainable way. One of the problems with seahorse fisheries is that we know almost nothing about them in a management context. Most fisheries globally, let me redo that. The fisheries that you and I experience in our countries are managed by complicated mathematical models that I might note have singularly failed to halt the decline of these resources, but nonetheless are given great credence and credibility. When you deal with developing country fisheries, and particularly coral reef fisheries, you're commonly dealing with many species being fished at once, using many types of gear, by many different people, landed in many different places. And they're just hell to manage. Where do you begin? So Bob Johannes, who's a friend of several of ours in this group, wrote, I think, a very important note that said, look, in those situations, the choice is not between perfect advice and imperfect advice. It's between imperfect advice and none at all. Many of my scientific colleagues would prefer to hold off on giving advice until they really know what to do. I guess I just don't have the confidence that I'm ever going to really know what we should do. And I'd rather get going with partial knowledge, being completely honest about the fact that to some extent we're dealing with guesswork. We certainly can't afford inaction any longer. So we were recently challenged to try to find a way to set a minimum size limit, as the Canada Alliance had bid us do, for seahorses. We sat down with a bunch of different expert groups. We talked to subsistence fishers in the Philippines, traditional medicine traders in Hong Kong, aquarium professionals at a regional workshop in North America, a national policy and management group in the Philippines, an international technical consulting group, and 6 of the world's better marine fish scientists. And we asked them, how do we manage these really data-poor fisheries? What on earth do we do for seahorses as one case study of complicated, challenging conservation management? And amazingly, when you think how disparate these 6 groups are, they independently, consulted over an 8-month period, came up with one vision of the top 2 priorities. There was complete consensus on the idea that we ought to look for minimum size limits and no-take zones. And I find that quite startling to have such a convergence among such different groups. They also wanted some form of spatial restriction, and they were less interested in the viability in economic terms of things like reducing the fishers or the catch. De facto, that'll happen, though. The minimum size limits for seahorses are particularly challenging because all 34 species are traded together, and 34 species, as we talked about earlier, are from very different sizes. So this is the size of the seahorses up the long axis there, up here, and this is the number of the species across the bottom. So the smallest species these are in centimeters, so this is about 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches. So the smallest species are about 1 inch, and the largest species are well over 1 foot. Now the idea ecologically with size limits is you want to allow the animals to reproduce before you kill them. You want to get a chance for them to contribute to the next generation before you remove them. And so we tried to determine when they would start breeding. And if you look at the green bars, ignore the red bars for the moment, you'll see that the differences in the size at which they start producing young are not as great as the differences in the overall size of the seahorse. Emboldened by this, taking a stab in the dark, our team recommended that we ought to set the minimum size limit for seahorse take at 4 inches or 10 centimeters. What that does, if you notice, is the smallest species are never traded. They never reach that height. But that's okay, because they're never traded anyway for the most part. Most species have a chance to reproduce and contribute to the next generation, we hope, before they enter the 4-inch category, but trade can still continue for the animals above 4 inches and below maximum size. And for these 3 species where green is higher than 4 inches, our management measure doesn't work terribly well. But that's actually okay because 2 of them are under specific management in their regions. Now, in the world of fisheries, this is a very daring proposal, that you should set one limit for 34 species with hugely different sizes. But the important point is for about 33 of those species, it'll work. And I think with these multi-species, multi-gear, difficult fisheries where we don't know much, scientists are going to have the courage to take these big leaps of faith and make recommendations which they will continue to modify with new knowledge. Now, the fishers also told us that they were, well, all of the stakeholder groups told us that they would also like to have no fishing zones. I'm constantly intrigued by the fact that North America is very, very slow to set up no fishing zones. Canada has 1 no fishing zone that would more or less fit in this room. I exaggerate only slightly. The U.S. has very, very few no fishing zones as well. What we call sanctuaries and parks are commonly still open to extraction. The theory behind no fishing zones is that the fish inside those zones should grow and reproduce such that their young spill out and might be entering the fishery or replenishing other areas, such that their adults spill out eventually as densities build up and be fished. And at the same time, if you're not fishing destructively in that area anymore, the habitat should improve. And of course, habitat improvement will also help fish to grow and reproduce. The Western world's been very slow to buy into this, but surprisingly, areas like the Philippines have been very quick to commit to no fishing zones, perhaps because desperation focuses the mind wonderfully. And in our part of the Philippines, we've been instrumental now in setting up 17 no fishing zones that are entirely community managed and enforced. In order to assess their impact, we work inside those areas and we compare them with outside those areas, and we compare them with distant areas not affected, we believe, by the no-take zone, to try to see what impact the no-take zone is having. We've got a lovely problem right now in the Philippines in that our areas that are distant and not meant to be part of any experimental management or no-take zones are now being turned into no-take zones because the fishing communities are convinced they make a very big difference. That isn't a situation we face yet here in North America, but it would be nice to see some engagement in that respect. So this, if you like, is moving out to a bigger framework of habitat recovery, of general community rebuilding for fisheries. But with it come other complications. You have to try to stop incursion into these no-take zones. We're also working hard to assist governments and enforcement officers to eliminate illegal fishing. For example, trawling is illegal in inshore waters of many Asian countries. The Philippines, you cannot trawl within about 10 miles of the coast. That's illegal. You cannot use dynamite fishing anywhere, and yet dynamite is widely used. You shouldn't be using cyanide fishing, or poison fishing, but that's widely used. And one of the biggest problems in resource management is the implementation of existing fisheries laws, marine resource management laws, and that's as true in North America as it is anywhere else in the world. So we're working with fishing communities to empower them to bring this illegal fishing under control. And the Canada Alliance has been very powerful with this, not least because, perhaps in a way I'm a little uncomfortable with, they made a list of all of their neighbors and friends who are using illegal fishing gear and sent it to the governor of the province. I'm glad I wasn't part of that one. They're also texting the police to warn them where the poachers are now. Now, texting is ubiquitous, even in people who have no money at home. Beyond that, you need to empower the communities such that they are capable of having courage to contact the mayors. They have the courage to actually contact the police and ask for help. They see them as supporters rather than enemies. And a lot of our work is assisting villages and towns and government officers, resource managers, to obtain the skills they need to hold meetings, to call on bigger support, to make citizens' arrests, and actually to gather group courage to move forward. Part of this, we have a high school scholarship program where teenagers are put through school and eventually university in exchange for working as conservation apprentices In this case, giving a puppet show about marine conservation to younger kids. Quite a lot of our work now is trying to empower women who are significant fishers in many parts of the Indo-Pacific, but are not given roles in resource management or in decision making. Of course, everything that the communities do depends largely on the pressures from outside, and particularly from the buyers or importers from elsewhere. So we work heavily with the Hong Kong traditional medicine community, and in China, Taiwan, and Singapore to some extent. So the TCM community in Hong Kong has become a fantastic ally. Voluntary codes of conduct, supporting our work, putting up posters, communicating with the practitioners and the patients. We also work with the public aquarium community, including representatives from New England Aquarium, to try to make certain that our messages about conservation and management are conveyed in a useful way, such that people who might buy seahorses, might trade in seahorses, have an understanding of the impact of their work. And I've just seen the seahorse signage in the New England Aquarium this afternoon and was delighted with the messages that it managed to convey very usefully. So we work with both sets of communities, seahorses being role models for this sort of type of collaboration and dialogue that should extend to other marine conservation concerns. Now, because we were able to work on the biology of these animals, we've resolved the taxonomy, we developed the basic life history understanding, we've come up with management recommendations, we've developed collaborations with consumer groups, we talk to government, we've been able to influence this international policy change that I mentioned at the very beginning. So let me introduce you to a United Nations convention called CITES. CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And rather cutesy for a UN convention, its logo is actually an elephant, if you look closely. You will know CITES mostly because it is involved in things like controlling trade in elephant ivory or rhinoceros horn or orchids or tigers or parrots or a heck of a lot more species. CITES comprises now 167 countries around the world and is unusual in being a convention that actually has regulatory legal teeth. It can enforce, very unusually. You'll notice in the list of species I mentioned that CITES addresses, there were no marine fish species. In fact, CITES has singularly refused to get involved in marine fishes of commercial importance. It has insisted that these are the responsibility of the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. But FAO has no enforcement capacity at all, and frankly, FAO couldn't give a toss about most species like seahorses. So we've been working hard to get CITES to pay attention to marine fish issues. And in 2002, 5 fishes were up for consideration when the 167, well, I think it was 160 countries at that point met. Not this species at that time, but instead a big reef fish called the humphead wrasse, huge, ginormous fish called the humphead wrasse. Neat animal, changes sex, spawns in big aggregations, all the rest of it. So that the parties were asked, the governments were asked to support the idea that there should be international regulations to address marine fish issues of commercial concern. CITES has the capacity to regulate international movement of any species on its lists. So the Patagonian toothfish was proposed for management at that point, or you probably know it as Chilean sea bass. Disastrously badly managed fishery, full of illegal, illicit, unreported fishing. Well, it got so controversial that Australia chose to pull it off the agenda instead of having an all-out diplomatic row. The next species up were the whale shark and the basking shark. Both of them were defeated. You need 2/3 majority. There was no way they were going to give it to the sharks. When it got to the seahorses, however, there had been an awful lot of discussion and dialogue for several years before at the international level. And instead of the 2/3 majority that was needed, 3/4 of the countries decided that yes, seahorses should be managed internationally. Now, we always claim that seahorses open doors for other species through their sheer charm. In this case, it was also through the conviction that they needed regulation. Because in the dying hours of that international meeting, after 2 weeks of argument, the 2 shark species were brought back for more discussion and another vote. And the argument that this convention could not deal with marine fishes of commercial importance, thank you, was suddenly very hollow. It had just committed to doing that precise thing with seahorses. And so immediately the two species of sharks were brought under international management. 2 years later, these species were brought up for discussion. And partly with the debate, the humphead wrasse was brought under international regulatory control, as was the great white shark. And all of a sudden, because of the blessed little seahorses, we have a new control mechanism for international trade in marine fishes of commercial importance. And de facto, what is being declared is that marine fishes are indeed wildlife. They're not just food, and they're not just economic commodities, although they are both of that. We've now got a great big challenge on our hands because under the listing, trade continues. It'll be the biggest wildlife trade issue internationally, with about 25-30 million animals traded among 80 countries, 34 species every year. And they all look alike to your average customs officer. Each country has to ensure that any exported animals were legally obtained. You'll remember I mentioned that shrimp trawling is largely illegal in inshore waters, so theoretically, those seahorses cannot be exported anymore. All exports can only continue if they do not damage wild populations. Well, some poor country that has no understanding of its seahorse populations, fisheries, or trades has a real challenge on their hands. And that's where we're trying to get involved with things like, if you remember, the minimum size limit proposal to help them out. Trying to assist countries figure out how to make sure that exports do not damage wild populations, which is a really important requirement for conservation. Now, all of this CITES action is fine. We don't yet know if it's going to make any difference. We've accomplished only a call to action. And we need to be wary of feeling too much smug pride when what we've really done is set ourselves a lot of work. My own belief is that unless we address the ultimate drivers of conservation problems in the world, we're going to be in real trouble. And those ultimate drivers are, of course, consumption and population. Well, beyond that is ethics and philosophy, but let's say consumption and population for the moment. I'm absolutely horrified that the global population will go up 50% in the next 45 years. Half as many people again by 2050. Certainly makes my blood run cold. If it doesn't yours, I'm surprised. Of course, I don't even want to think about the rate of consumption increase, particularly in our part of the world. We all know that it's a multiplication exercise between consumption and population. Locally, population is a huge problem in developing countries. Globally, I think we all know where the huge problem lies. Going back to my annoying point, stay off the shrimp at the very least, I think. If we go beyond this, well, if we're to make any strides, really, in conservation writ large, whether it's not eating shrimp or buying seafood sustainably, or just being alert to global problems, we're going to depend heavily on education and outreach. We do our best through talks in the media, producing professional materials, but we really like to work in partnership with the public aquaria and with any other like-minded organizations and individuals, because the messages are big and they need to be circulated very widely indeed. I guess the take-home message is when you come down to try to manage the exploitation of seahorses for traditional medicine, I want to repeat, you can start with the fish, but if you don't take into account the fishers and their communities and their countries and our global squeeze on it all, it's honestly pretty hard to imagine how we're going to sort out the sort of continued sustainable use that's vital for two types of fathers who share one ocean. Thank you very much. You're out there. Welcome. Hi.
I was wondering, like, in rainforests, done in the Southeast Asian rainforest and Brazil that's in the Amazon using sustainable species. I was wondering if there might be some sustainable kind of market that you might pursue in seahorse fishing areas, and if this empowerment of women might actually tie into that somehow.
Yeah, it's a very fair question. I think we have to find ways of using resources in an acceptable manner that considers the future. I'm commonly asked why we do not advocate banning the trade. And the answer to that's pretty simple. First of all, bans I don't think often work. I mean, we have prohibition of drugs and things like that to prove that to us. But also, we tend to move people from one resource to another. We tend to deplete one resource, move on to the next, ban the trade amount, move on to the next, close the fishery, move on to the next. At some point you rather run out of options, and that's what's happened in many of these inshore developing countries. So it's also happening in some of our fisheries too. You're just running out of options. So I don't think we can keep that route. We just need to find a way to take a stand and work collectively to set limits on it. That's going to be a lot easier if people have choices as to how to earn money and they're not trapped into fisheries. Make no mistake about it, most developing country fishers would love the chance to earn income in other ways if they could. They're not wedded to fishing. So I think it's going to be a combination of many different approaches that's going to give hope. And I'm still tossing around with my team and with many other like-minded people how we give communities options beyond fishing. And that's going to all have to do with global trade dynamics and microloans and complicated reconsiderations of responsibility. Talking about microloans brings me into talking about women a little bit. In many of these societies, women are the key determinants and decision makers of financial management in the family, of resource management. We find commonly the women are the best advocates for community groups that are worried about resource use in the future. But they also often lack a voice. And we have to find ways, I think, to bring the other half of the population into resource management, allow women a voice. I've just gone through a bit of a shake-up in my own thinking. I digress, but I think it's interesting. Women's fishing has not been well evaluated. We know women are involved in processing the fish and marketing the fish and often setting up the fishing gear and that sort of peripheral activity. But I don't think we've realized how much women actually catch themselves, particularly in developing countries and island countries. And some of the first studies around suggested they may be catching as much as half of the fish by weight in some areas. But they do it in a quiet way, picking in the intertidal, fishing in inshore shallow waters. It's all very unspectacular, so it's commonly not even noticed. I want to emphasize the women fish inshore, in the intertidal, or close to the shore. We don't really talk to them enough, we collectively as a global community, when we set up resource management. And one of the real priorities is becoming these no-take reserves on a global scale. And where do you think we put the no-take reserves? They're anchored to the shore. What is that likely to do to women's fishing? And when you take into account that the first research, or early research, or current research suggests that women get the food that keeps the family going on a stable basis, and men are more involved in what we call lottery fisheries. When you get fish or you don't. When you get it, it's high value. When you don't, it's worrying. Then removing women's fishing disproportionately may be really worrying for families as well as for community dynamics. So I digress, but I think in the context of pregnant males, maybe that's a fair digression. And there needs to be more consideration of that. Sorry, long-winded answer, but you asked your question.
Just for one small segment of the world trade in seahorses. There's an issue on the table now, and that's for aquarists. Whether there should be a big push for entirely restricting trade in seahorses to domestically bred individuals versus continuing to patronize some of these subsistence communities by supporting the wild catch fishery. What would you advise that these people do?
Yeah, Les Kaufman, one of my buddies in marine conservation. Les brings up a really good question in that Aquaculture is often touted as a possible contributor, hopefully not a panacea, but a contributor to global conservation of marine resources, freshwater resources too. I suspect most people in this room will know it's not quite that simple. There's an awful lot of complication with aquaculture. You often catch too many wild fish for broodstock. You often hold them in a way that diminishes the quality of the local marine environment or spreads disease or exotic species escape, etc., etc. Aquaculture has been tried a lot for seahorses over the last 30 years or so, particularly in China, but now in many countries around the world, and it usually doesn't work on a large scale. These animals need live food, so you culture the algae to culture the food to culture the adults, although some good organizations are getting over that. They form these tight social bonds, they have spatial organization. They're just not great if you throw a whole bunch in a tub and mix them up regularly. There are, however, as Les has indicated, a number of aquaculture ventures beginning to do quite well on the small scale to support the aquarium industry. And on the face of it, that sounds jolly nice. You know, if you can breed them, why not? So those my concern comes on a couple of levels. And, you know, I'm certainly open to the idea, but one level is you're removing livelihoods from subsistence fishers again, and you're effectively banning the trade if you get everybody using cultured animals, and I'm not sure that's the best way to engage people in wise resource management. And the other concern is that I think that if you had a ready supply on the market, you probably would not necessarily diminish the wild capture, but might just create a new demand that you met through the domestic culturing. We're certainly finding that with the dried trade. There is an aquaculture venture going near Hong Kong in mainland China that's doing rather well in a startup way, and they're fostering brand new markets. There's new seahorse wine, new seahorse formulas that they can't even meet the demand they're fostering. So clearly we're a little unhappy about that. So aquaculture is not a panacea. It may be a contributor in some ways. It's unlikely to replace wild capture, nor necessarily should it. I just want to go back to link those 2 points. There are many important ventures, but the Marine Stewardship Council is attempting to work to find ways to ensure that exploitation of marine fishes is sustainable and that we know what we can choose. It's a labeling program. And the Marine Aquarium Council is similarly trying to develop labeling techniques that will tell us which aquarium fish it's okay to buy in an ecologically sustainable fashion. Those certification techniques are supported by many ventures by the public aquaria, which give us seafood choices, including by many of them. So, not a simple answer, but aquaculture shouldn't be depended on to solve our problems. We're going to have to get serious about resource management. We've got to stop pretending there are quick fixes that allow us to deke out of our management responsibilities.
One more question.
Okay, that's it. I should have said that. Seahorses are used to treat asthma, arteriosclerosis, impotence, incontinence, thyroid disorders, broken bones, facilitate childbirth, and a host of other things. And lest we giggle, which people always do, lest we giggle, we ought to be a little bit cognizant of the fact that traditional Chinese medicine, at least, has a pretty reasonable history of sorting out chronic ailments. Seahorses are not used singly as a solo ingredient. They're used as one compound mixed with many others. And I think our own medicine takes that approach. Quite a number of health issues too. We take core products and mix them with others. I also want to point out that in traditional medicine, each patient is treated individually, at least in classical traditional medicine, in a very tailored fashion. We don't manage that quite as well in our Western medicine, or at least not in the medicine I know. Traditional medicine is, however, changing all the time, and patent medicine or pre-packaged processed medicine is entering the market. That's much more formulaic. And unfortunately, the consumer no longer controls the product. In conservation context, this has real anxieties. Consumers prefer large, pale, smooth seahorses. So really, the Chinese medicine community is very happy with the idea that we ban use of the small seahorses because they only really want the large seahorses for traditional medicine. However, the pre-packaged patent medicine is very happy to use all the small stuff. So we have to really keep an eye on what's happening with manufacturers of traditional Chinese medicine products. It is worth pointing out that many different symptoms can result from the same core problem. So for example, I might have rapid heartbeat, you might have a skin ailment, and you might have terrible jaw ache, and they all might result from a stress. So traditional Chinese medicine, I've developed a huge amount of respect for, to the point where I use it myself now for certain chronic ailments. As an N of 1, I can tell you that it's quite effective for certain chronic ailments. The single biggest thing that hampers our capacity to effect global change in marine conservation is Western arrogance. I mean, I can only repeat that. We go into different cultures and societies and we know exactly what to do, and we do it quickly, and we do it at high volume, and we do it in English. And I can tell you that some of the greatest breakthroughs we've had are because I don't say a word in Hong Kong TCM meetings. Our Hong Kong Chinese team looks after that. And I don't say a word in those village meetings in the Philippines. Our Filipino team looks after that. In their culture, their language, their way, and they restrain me from my excessive enthusiasm on a particular direction that's likely to lead us to hell and damnation. So if we want to make a change, it's going to have to be with our ears open and our mouths shut. And I would say that applies to more than just marine conservation as well. Everybody in this room is hugely, to use a Filipino term, hugely empowered. I think we really do have this sense of global responsibility, or we should at least. I think most of us do have this sense of global responsibility. It's a little bit of a homily, but as you can see, I feel it from the heart, and I think most of you are here tonight because you do as well. So thanks very much for coming out. I really appreciate it.